On April 9, 1865, the Civil War ended with the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Northern General Ulysses S. Grant at the courthouse in Appomattox. Trusting in Lee's honor, Grant accepted the Southern general's word that he would go home and no longer take up arms against the Union. Incredibly, Lee and his soldiers left Appomattox that day astride their horses with their guns still on their shoulders. Grant felt that he could trust his opponent after having served beside Lee throughout the U.S.-Mexico War. The generous terms were offered in hope to set the stage for healing the divisions that had caused the Civil War. Although Lee remained true to his word, there were many who sought to keep the South in a state of rebellion. Foremost among them was John Wilkes Booth, who managed to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln just 6 days later during a showing of a play at Ford's Theater. His death brought Andrew Johnson to the presidency, something no one had thought possible. Johnson had been placed on the Republican ticket in an attempt to send a message of national unity. Johnson had been the only U.S. senator of a Confederate state to remain loyal to the Union. He had been a slave owner, purchasing 10 different individuals while supporting the Democratic Party's pro-slavery agenda. He even went on record endorsing the false pseudoscience that slavery was the result of one race having more intelligence than another. During the Civil War, Johnson came to support emancipation as a way to punish the Confederate elite. He freed his own slaves on April 8, 1863, after his state, Tennessee, outlawed the practice. Although he reached the right conclusion, he did so 3 months after the Emancipation Proclamation had ordered their freedom. Now, Johnson, the former slaveholder himself, was to oversee the reconstruction of the United States of America. The two most pressing issues were how to care for the thousands of newly freed individuals and how to punish the Southerners who had rebelled against the Union. 3 Reconstruction plans were put forth. First was Lincoln's original plan, which provided amnesty or forgiveness to most ex-Confederates. 10% of the citizens of each Southern state would have to take a loyalty oath. All states would have to approve the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. The second plan was put forth by a group of congressmen known as the Radical Republicans. They sought to pass the Wade-Davis Bill, which would force the majority of each state's white men to pledge an oath of loyalty. Next, each state would have to form a new government composed of 100% non-Confederates. Those governments would be forced to adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But the plan didn't stop there, as those who had risen in rebellion would be permanently stripped of their voting rights. The third plan was Johnson's limited Reconstruction Plan, which gave amnesty to any white who signed loyalty oaths, including individuals like Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, the instigator of the Pillow Massacre of unarmed African Americans. States would have to abolish slavery and pay their war debts, but Johnson's plan never carved out a role for African Americans, giving them no vote in the selection of the new leaders of the rebellious states. Johnson began the process of Reconstruction with the intention of enacting his plan. He pardoned 13,000 former Confederates, proclaiming that, quote, "white men alone must manage the South." Each state rewrote their constitution, but Mississippi didn't ratify the 13th Amendment, the one that proclaimed slavery is illegal until 2013. Despite the limited advancement of rights, the rebelling states were readmitted and took their seats in Washington, D.C. in December of 1865. The group sent to Washington included 58 Confederate congressmen, 6 men who had served in President Jefferson Davis's cabinet, and 4 Southern generals. Although the president declared Reconstruction done right then and there, the Congress wasn't quite so sure, refusing to let the new congressmen take their seats, setting up a fight with the president. The radical Republican Congress passed a law establishing the Freedmen's Bureau, a group which would assist former slaves as well as poor whites in the South by distributing clothing and food. Over the next few years, the government agency would set up 40 hospitals, 4,000 schools, 61 industrial institutes, and 74 teacher training centers. They would have likely done more, but suffered consistently from a lack of government-apportioned funds. The Congress also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which overturned the ugly Dred Scott precedent by granting all African Americans citizenship in the U.S., while simultaneously outlawing any state from passing discriminatory laws that severely restricted African Americans' lives. Although all slaves had been freed, states like Mississippi and South Carolina had passed a series of laws known as Black Codes, which prohibited blacks from carrying weapons, serving on juries, testifying against whites, marrying whites, or traveling without permits. A few states even made it illegal for black men or women to own land. President Johnson, however, used his ability to veto both pieces of legislation. Race riots in 1866, including a particularly violent one in Memphis, which resulted in the death of 48 African Americans, as well as the destruction of all 12 of the city's black schools, provided enough support for Congress to push back against Johnson and override his presidential veto, something that can only happen if 2/3 of the House and Senate agree. Once in control, the radical Republican Congress passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which threw out the previously accepted governments of the southern states, replacing them with military generals who would rule the newly created 5 military districts. South Carolina was lumped in with North Carolina beneath General Daniel Sickles. Tennessee, President Johnson's home state, was the only rebellious state to avoid being placed in a military district. The military occupation would only end after voters, including African American men, had a say in the creation of new state constitutions, which ensured African American men the right to vote.